friends, the long wait has officially ended. For those of you I know who have been sitting there very patiently waiting for season 11 of the show, up ahead in 2025, it's another year of what we hope to be interesting topics, conversations, talking about all things kind of government purchasing, what's going on in industry. Obviously, we'll have your crazy bids as well. I'm Bill Culhane, the host of the Big Bid Theory. You can probably tell if you look behind me, I've moved into Studio 22. We talked about that at the end of season 10. And you can also see that we have our very first guest of season 11. Darren Olson is kind enough to join us. Darren, we appreciate you sitting into the Big Bid Theory today.
Thanks so much for having me.
No doubt. And I'll have you know, and I thought about this because one of our researchers did some background on you, and it was totally unplanned. But come to find out, we are now going to have back-to-back guests who are graduates of the University of Illinois on this show. Keith Glanz, people will remember, public purchasing legend, was our very last guest of season 10. And sure enough, we looked at your background. You're a University of Illinois graduate, and some folks will remember back to I guess it was 2021. We had Dr. Joseph Schofer from Northwestern University, of course, an expert on all things U.S. infrastructure. So you are also a graduate of Northwestern. Again, total coincidence.
Yeah, so I can say go Illini, right?
Go Illini. Yeah, I guess go Wildcats
And
as well.
Wildcats too. Yes.
Yeah. So a little bit about Darren, and then we will talk about ASCE. We'll talk about the recently released report card. So Darren, let me make sure I get this right. Darren is the VP and department head for the Water Resources Department at Christopher B. Burke Engineering in Rosemont, just outside of Chicago, over near O'Hare. And Darren is also, make note of this, applicable to our conversation, the chair of the ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineers Report Card Committee. So to kind of set the scene, and Darren, I'm not sure if Rob passed this along to you, but it was 8 years ago, Greg DiLoretto, who was past president of ASCE, had him on the show. And let me get this right. The U.S. infrastructure grade 8 years ago was D plus. Since
That's
then,
correct.
we've had Brian Palish from ASCE on. Fast forward to December of 2021, Emily Feenstra, a managing director there at the time at ASCE, she came on. And of course, that was right after the infrastructure bill was signed. And so 4 years ago, if my higher math is correct, the U.S. infrastructure had a C minus grade. And so we're going to talk about all things U.S. infrastructure, or some things U.S. infrastructure, Darren. But first of all, can you kind of remind us, fill us in on the report card, what the committee does, what the committee looks at in generating the final product?
Sure. So, I'll even take one step back behind that. So, the American Society of Civil Engineers, we represent 160,000 civil engineers throughout both the United States and around the world. And every 4 years, we put out this report card on America's infrastructure. Infrastructure is really the foundation of our national economy, the U.S. global competitiveness, quality of life that, from the water we drink to the roads that we drive on. And we as civil engineers are in charge of designing, operating, and maintaining that. So we really feel it's part of our mission to let both our elected officials and the public in general know what is the state of our infrastructure, something that people take for granted most of the time, but it definitely is very important to the United States, and we feel it's important for us to put out those report card every 4 years. And so we spend, probably 18 months. Our committee, we have 52 engineers that are experts in all of these 18 different categories of infrastructure. We spend about 18 to 24 months researching all of the nationally available data that's put out by whether it be the U.S. government, various institutions, public and private sector, NGOs, and we mine all this data and then start to formulate What is the state of our infrastructure? And we look at 8 key criteria. So we have a very specific methodology that we follow, and we look at capacity, condition, funding, future need, operation and maintenance, public safety, resilience, and innovation. And we do that for all 18 categories of infrastructure. We total up all the grades, and then that leads to the report card grade that we're about to discuss.
So just to make sure that everybody caught that, you said 18 categories. And full disclosure, I'm an open book. Before I had my conversation, I was sitting in Jonesboro, Arkansas back in May, exactly 8 years ago this month. I was at an event in Jonesboro at Arkansas State University, and I'm having my conversation with Greg, and I had no idea about the true scope of the report card because, and I think I'm like many, you say infrastructure, and people instantly think, oh, they're talking about roads, they're talking about bridges, they're talking about the grid, period, dot. But it's much more than that.
It's so much, and it's things that are so often out of sight and out of mind. Every morning you and I wake up, we turn on the faucet, we flush the toilet. There is a whole water supply system beneath our feet when we're walking around or driving on the roads, and that water system has got to purify water. It's got to transmit it to our building, to our home, and then it's got to take the wastewater away. And those are just two of the categories. So I touched on drinking water and wastewater. Those are just two of these 18 categories of infrastructure, but it kind of gives you the sense of how out of sight and out of mind these can be. But they're things we use every day, right? I mean, we depend on rail systems and ports to deliver. Without ports, all these brown boxes that show up at our doorsteps every day, right? without ports, those wouldn't make it into the country and then make it to our homes to deliver the Amazon packages. And so that's really part of the report card too, is just to educate people on the scope of infrastructure. It's enormous.
Yeah, and that's a tremendous setup. Thanks for putting the ball on the tee there, Darren. If our audience, if you'll go to the description of the podcast, Rick, Lauren will somebody will actually put a link to the report card there and some other information about ASCE as well. So check it out. So I just said it a moment ago, 8 years ago, US infrastructure got a grade of D plus. 4 years ago, a little bit later, a little bit better, I beg your pardon. And so March 25th, which depending on when people are watching this episode, about a month and a half ago or so. First of all, Darren, go ahead and share with us the US infrastructure grade. And if you would also kind of talk about some of the positives, because I did notice, again, if my higher math is correct, 16 of the 18 categories either had the same grade as 4 years ago or had an improved grade. So take it away in terms of the grade and the positives.
Absolutely. So happy to report for the first time ever, our cumulative GPA for U.S. infrastructure is a C, and that is the highest that it's ever been. Um, for those that have been around since 1998, we started off way in the D category, and so we've since seen that rise and rise. And as you had mentioned, we were 8 years ago we were a D plus, 4 years ago we were a C minus, and this year um, we are a C. So a lot of positives that we can take out of this, and I'll start to go through a few here. One of the positives that we saw is that of these 18 categories of infrastructure, and I'm going to say a few more we haven't mentioned yet, just because it's important to think of the scope of infrastructure. So, like aviation, we've got stormwater, we've got transit and schools. So all these different categories of infrastructure. For the first time since um, uh, we started, no category of infrastructure received a D minus grade. So that's important because in the past, we have had categories of infrastructure that are in the D minus range. And that is where this infrastructure is in very poor condition. So for the first time, we were fortunate that none of the categories were in a D minus. And you are correct that of the 18 categories, 16 of them either stayed the same or improved. And in fact, eight categories improved. So that's a big improvement. So nearly half of the categories of infrastructure that we graded improved. So that would maybe lead to the question of what happened, right? Why did we see infrastructure improve over the course of the last 4 years? And two things that we can point to. The first is the 2021 Infrastructure Investment in Jobs Act, or IIJA, as it's been called so affectionately. This is really, it's one of the most largest and comprehensive infrastructure spending packages in U.S. history. It was about a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill over 5 years. But most importantly, around 550 billion, or about half of that, was brand new funding. So it just wasn't reauthorizing existing funding programs, it was actually creating new funding. And that funding spanned almost all of these 18 categories. So we had funding for transit, we had funding for roads, we had funding for bridges, certainly like those surface transportation type infrastructure categories had the majority of the new funding, but there was funding for water and other areas as well, ports. But then we saw another package as well, the Inflation Reduction Act, otherwise known as IRA, that added a lot of funding when it comes to, we think of the energy grid, right? A lot of that funding from IRA started to help us down this path that we're seeing now of transitioning to renewables. Energy and is one of the 18 categories that I haven't talked about yet, but energy is, we could probably spend most of the podcast just talking about the energy infrastructure category alone. It's got a lot of complexities there, but it's one that saw a lot of demand and a lot of need there, and a lot of funding. So it's had some unique circumstances. But all in all, the takeaway on the positive side of the report card is that we saw investment in our infrastructure. And that investment in infrastructure led to increases in grades. We saw increases in condition. We saw increases in capacity. We saw increases in funding for many of these different categories of infrastructure. So the takeaway note to both our elected officials and the public is, hey, when we invest in infrastructure, it improves, right? And so that's a direct causal cause and effect relationship there. And it's something that benefits every American family. It benefits the U.S. economy and benefits our global competitiveness.
Yeah, all those things are quite true. And Darren, as I heard you go through the positives, I caught myself sitting here, and maybe some in our audience remember as well, whether it be the conversation with Greg, Brian, um, Emily, whomever, but talking about the fact that by improving infrastructure, it actually puts money back into the pockets of American families, whether it means fewer car repairs needed, whether it means if the grid is in such a state that it's supporting us, that you're not losing electricity as often and having to replace the food in your refrigerator. And I could go on, but
Mhm.
I think that's one of the keys here, isn't it? Is that for John and Jane Doe citizen in the US, this is meaningful news.
Absolutely. So right now, every American family is losing $2,700 a year due to poor infrastructure. And you hit the nail on the head in exactly what you said. It's throwing out the food in your refrigerator when the power goes out. It's car repairs because you go over potholes on a failing road. It's detouring around a bridge that's causing you extra time. And so right now, every American family is losing $2,700 a year because of that. If we continue to invest the way we currently are, with the IIJ funding in place, we're saving American families. We'll save them $700 of that a year. So that's $700 back in their pocket. That's a strong message, right? I mean, that's money that can go back into buying goods and services, gets pumped back into the economy. And also, we've all been late to soccer games. We've been late to work. We've had to have these things happen to us. And we live in a society where we would hope that our infrastructure can support us better than it is.
Yeah, here, here. I could not agree anymore. As a matter of fact, take you behind the curtain. I'm about a 5 minute walk from standing in the northbound lane of I-35 that goes through Austin. And as Austin has grown over the years, as the I-35 corridor has grown from, let's say, north of Austin down to San Antonio, so many projects going on. However, I travel quite a bit. As a matter of fact, I'll be in Spokane, Washington next week. You look around the country and there are still opportunities for improvement. So as we transition from the positive, Darren, coming out from the ASCE report card, as far as, and I don't want to use the word negatives, but let's just say opportunities for improvement. I know energy and rail, there are some questions there, but what are some of the takeaways in terms of opportunities for improvement, things left to be done?
Yeah, and so I'll first start with a C grade is not something that anyone really is going to be proud of, right? We've improved and we've shown improvement, but a C grade is not something that I would want to bring home on a report card. It's not something I want my kids to bring home in a report card. So we're making progress around the margins, but we've been underinvesting in our infrastructure for decades. And infrastructure takes a long time to improve. You just don't add some funding and the next thing all of your roads and bridges are in good condition. These are as you've seen probably in the I-35 corridor, these are projects that take a long time through the planning, design, permitting process. So as long as it took us to get to where we're at with infrastructure, and we've now started to turn the corner, hopefully, it's going to take us a long time to get us to a grade that we're proud to bring home. And when we look at the grades in a little bit more detail, sure, 8 of them improved, but we still have a whole bunch that are in the D range, right? And these that we see in the D range, they're things we depend on every day. These are our roads, our stormwater drainage system, right? In Texas, and you have to go far out of Texas or North Carolina, or even in the Midwest to know how important our stormwater drainage system is. So, I mean, there still are a lot of categories that are really low, and need some improvement. I'll say there are two categories that actually went down in grade, which one was energy and one was rail. The rail grade, we've got a very strong rail network. It's one of our highest grades. It's in the B range. It was lowered to a B minus, primarily to some safety concerns that we had. There are, since 2020, there's been an increase in rail safety incidents. We're all aware of what happened in East Palestine, and that wasn't like a one-off. That's kind of we started to see a bit of a trend there with rail safety. So that led to that grade decline. And energy is really that energy grid is so complex, that has had a lot of increased investments. We've seen renewables here in the Midwest. I don't drive too far out of cities, and you start seeing the wind turbines and the solar fields. And so we're getting some renewable energy sources in place, which is great, to help us transition to a more sustainable energy system. But at the same time, we're having to kind of rewire the United States in order to take what used to be fixed energy generation locations, right? A power plant here and there, and they would get on the grid. Now we've got energy generation distributed really throughout the United States. So we're rewiring our electric grid, and at the same time, we've got a lot of demand on that electric grid because we've got EVs, we've got these data centers. You and I don't know how much you use AI. Some of us are starting to use it, but when you talk to the vast majority of younger people, I mean, they're using AI all the time, and that takes just an enormous amount of computational data, which takes a large amount of energy. And so we're seeing a huge increase in the demand for energy. And on the supply side, this unique nature of distributed energy generation is created challenges as well.
Yeah, no doubt. And being here in Austin, Texas, kind of in the epicenter in many ways of energy, at least in this country, I think anybody in our audience who is also here in the state of Texas, the Lone Star State, will never ever forget what took place in February of 2021 when the Texas grid went out. That will be forever burned in my memory. So energy, newsflash, energy is important. Um, in case anybody's wondering. Um, One element of the methodology of the report, and you went through them, Darren, is funding.
Mhm.
So, I don't know, you obviously have your ears to the ground, so to speak, and you have your opinions, but um, I've heard mention some people have suggested that the government by itself cannot do all of this alone. And I've heard some people suggest more privatization of funding for infrastructure. Just your thoughts on that.
So there really isn't one magic formula for funding, especially when we look at either different locations or different infrastructure categories. But what we do know is that there definitely is a mix of funding that is better than just one funding source alone. And so, there certainly is a need for federal investment in our infrastructure. And unfortunately, if you look at what that federal investment is, like especially in like the water sector, it has been declining for where it used to be, 50 years ago, 60, 70% of our water infrastructure was federally funded. And now that's down closer, 10% or even under. Um, so, there's federal funding needed. There's local funding, whether it's, counties, municipalities, states, they've got a role to play in this. But you're right, the private sector absolutely does have a role in it. And there are some infrastructure categories that, private investment is better suited for than others. But you look at probably our two highest infrastructure categories as far as grades, which are rail and ports, and they have a great mix of all of that funding, right? Our rail system, freight rail system, is has a good chunk of that is privately funded, and ports have a great mix of both federal and local and private funding as well. So the short answer is everyone, there's a role for everyone to play, and there's not one magic funding allocation. It changes based on where you're at and what's part of the infrastructure you're talking about.
So, real quickly, Darren, that's kind of a lead up. And over the years, I've called it the crystal ball segment, really clever. But right after our audience goes to the description of this episode and they look at the ASCE report card, in terms of US infrastructure, what do you see ahead in the next year, 2 years, 4 years, et cetera?
So I see we have turned a corner, and I guess I'll answer this in two ways. So um, as this report card came out, it was clear that we have turned somewhat of a corner in U.S. infrastructure as far as I believe what this report card is going to hopefully let our elected officials know is that when we invest in our infrastructure, it pays off. That infrastructure improves, and we've seen that over the last 4 years. We've seen an increase in investment in infrastructure, and it has started to improve. So the hope would be that the era of us being in the D range and worried about our infrastructure making the news because it's failing rather than it improving. We're hoping that those days um, may be coming to an end. Um, I will say that there is some when we talk about things like resilience, which is one of the categories that we grade our infrastructure on, and it's one when you talked about the power outage in Texas, resilience of our electric grid. That's something that's going to be extremely important in the next decade to 50 years is how do we make our infrastructure resilient to both natural disasters as well as man-made disasters. And there becomes a little bit of concern of, given some of the things we've seen with the FEMA, some of the FEMA grants now being pulled back, is that resilience still going to be as important as we move forward? And it's because it's clearly going to be. We're clearly going to need to make our infrastructure resilient. The hope is that as we're turning this corner, that both the public and our elected officials know just how important that's going to be, because we have a huge investment gap in our infrastructure, and we need to keep forward on this path of trying to fill that gap with sustained and even more investment.
Well, Darren, I couldn't agree any more with you, and I think it's important. Obviously, we think it's important here to keep this conversation out in the forefront. Do appreciate your time so much. Is there anything coming up on your calendar, Darren? Any events that you'd like to share with our audience before we sign off?
Absolutely. So the American Society of Civil Engineers will have people on the mall in Washington D.C. for Infrastructure Week, which is the week of May 12th. So I would encourage folks that are interested in infrastructure, in addition to visiting our website at www.infrastructure.org, to come out to the mall on that week. And there's going to be a whole bunch of different organizations, including ours, talking about infrastructure.
Well, Darren, again, on behalf of everybody here at the show, our audience, we appreciate you carving some time out, and all the best to you.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to you.